The fog on the Oregon coast was a thick white wall, concealing everything except the sound of the surf. Stephen, a haunted former rescue swimmer, believed this was just a simple survey job. Alongside his dog Ghost, he walked toward the shore. Suddenly, Ghost froze, growling into the empty void. Directly in front of them, looming through the mist, something enormous emerged. It was not a ship. It was a mountain of steel, broken in two. The bow jutted toward the sky at an unnatural, threatening angle. The wreck was silent, but to Stephen it was screaming. He froze, paralyzed, as the sight instantly unlocked the most horrific memory of his life: the hand of a little girl slipping from his grasp in the middle of a storm. Please support us by subscribing to our channel. The hand was the only thing that was clear. It was small, pale, and streaked with engine grease. Rain, so cold it felt like needles, hammered down from a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The world was a screaming chaos of wind and water, a symphony of noise so loud it became a physical pressure against his ears, the shriek of the storm, the roar of the helicopter blades above, and the groaning metal of the trawler as it tore itself apart on the rocks. He was in the water, suspended in the violent blackness, his rescue harness digging into his ribs. His fins kicked uselessly against a current that sought to drag him under. He had the girl. His gloved hand was locked onto her thin wrist. She was so light, almost weightless in the surging foam. He shouted words that were stolen by the wind, words of reassurance. "I have you. Hold on. Just hold on." Her face was a blur of terror, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. Then the wave hit. It was not a wave. It was a wall of cold, dark ocean that rose up and collapsed on them. The impact was brutal, a sensory overload that ripped the air from his lungs. His grip, trained by years of repetition, was iron. But the water was stronger. He felt the impossible slip. The small wrist, the tiny hand, it just dissolved, pulled away by an indifferent ocean. "Carrie!" Stephen awoke with a gasp, his body rigid. The name was a harsh whisper in the profound silence of the cabin. His heart hammered against his ribs. He was not in the water. He was in a rented cabin, the sheets twisted around his legs. The only sound was the distant, muffled rhythm of the Oregon surf and the quiet breathing of the animal lying beside his cot. A heavy head lifted from the floor and pressed gently against his thigh. Stephen looked down into the calm, intelligent amber eyes of his companion. Ghost, a 6-year-old German shepherd, watched him without blinking. His coat was not the traditional black and tan, but a pale, striking dilution of silver gray and white, making him look more like a wolf than a dog. He was a large animal, built with lean muscle, but his temperament was one of silent, watchful patience. Ghost was not a guard dog in the typical sense. He was attuned not to threats from the outside world, but to the storms that raged inside Stephen. "It's okay, boy," Stephen murmured, his voice hoarse. He swung his legs over the side of the cot, his bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor. He sat there for a long moment, running a trembling hand over the dog's broad head. Ghost leaned into the touch, offering silent, solid comfort. This was his life now. This was why he was here. Stephen, a man in his late 40s, was a ghost himself, haunting the edges of the life he once knew. He was tall and lean, with the wiry strength of a man who had spent 2 decades in constant, grueling physical motion. His face was etched with a permanent weariness, a roadmap of sun and stress. His short brown hair was aggressively gray at the temples. He was, by training and trade, a Coast Guard aviation survival technician. A rescue swimmer. He had been one of the best. Until the storm in 2019, until Carrie. After the inquiry, after the formal condolences, and the quiet pity in his comrade's eyes, he had simply stopped. The roaring helicopters, the smell of jet fuel and salt, the adrenaline, it all became linked to that one singular moment of failure. The hand slipping away. He honorably discharged, took his pension, and drifted. Now he was here, in a Spartan one-room cabin in the tiny, fog-shrouded coastal hamlet of Sea Haven Point, Oregon. He pushed himself up and walked to the small kitchenette, Ghost's claws ticking quietly on the floorboards behind him. He started a pot of coffee, the ritual mechanical and grounding. He did not come here for the view. He came here for the quiet and for the job. On his laptop, open on the small pine table, was the contract. An insurance underwriter needed a structural survey of a wreck. The motor vessel Odyssey, a 400-foot freighter, had run aground here 3 months prior during a severe winter storm. The crew had been evacuated, but the ship was a total loss, broken in two on a treacherous shoal. The job was simple: dive the wreck, assess the primary damage, record the structural integrity, and file a report. No heroics, no lives in the balance, just him, the steel, and the sea. It was solitary work, and it paid well enough to keep the world at bay for another few months. "Just a job, boy," he said to Ghost, who sat patiently by the door, waiting for their morning walk. "Just a look at some broken metal." An hour later, they were in his old truck, bumping down the saturated dirt track that served as the only access to the beach. The fog was absolute, a wall of damp white cotton that muffled the world. He parked near a weathered sign warning of unstable cliffs. Stephen zipped up his old Coast Guard deck jacket. It was worn, the reflective patches dull, but it was warm. He opened the passenger door, and Ghost hopped out, his paws sinking into the wet sand. The dog did not bound ahead. He stayed close, his body brushing Stephen's leg, sensing the proximity of the ocean. They walked toward the sound of the surf. The fog was so thick that Stephen could only see 20 feet ahead. The air was cold, heavy, and smelled of salt, kelp, and something else. A faint metallic tang. Rust. At first there was nothing, just the gray expanse of sand meeting the gray void of the fog. Then it emerged. It was not a ship. It was a mountain of oxidized red steel that rose from the mist like the carcass of a forgotten leviathan. Stephen stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The summary had not prepared him for the scale of it. This was the bow section of the Odyssey. It had been snapped clean from the rest of the vessel and shoved onto the shoal, where it now jutted skyward at an unnatural, agonizing angle. It was a horrifying, majestic sight. Barnacles and seaweed clung to its wounded flank. Even in the stillness, he could hear the faint groans of metal settling under its own impossible weight. Further down the beach, barely visible, was the stern half, lying low in the water like a half-submerged tomb. The air felt heavy, suffocating. This was not just broken metal. This was a monument to failure, a visceral reminder that the sea always wins. He stood frozen, the image of the broken freighter blurring with the memory of the broken trawler. He felt the cold of the storm 4 years ago, the sting of the rain. He felt the phantom sensation of Carrie's hand slipping away. The wreck was a testament to the exact moment his life had broken in two. Ghost, sensing the sudden tension radiating from Stephen, pushed his head hard against his master's hand and let out a low, anxious whine. The sound broke the spell. Stephen flinched, then looked down at the dog. He forced his lungs to take in the cold, damp air. He flexed the fingers of his right hand, the one that had held her. He was not there. He was here. This was not a rescue. It was a job. He gave Ghost a rough scratch behind the ears. "Right," he whispered, his voice unsteady. He looked back at the colossal, gaping wound of the Odyssey. "Okay, let's get to work." The next morning, the fog had thinned, pulling back like a dirty curtain to reveal the full, terrible majesty of the wreck. The Odyssey dominated the coastline, a ruptured steel carcass that the sea had chewed on and spat out. Stephen worked with a methodical, practiced rhythm. It was a comfort, this ritual of preparation. He backed his truck as close to the beach access path as he could, the heavy-duty suspension groaning. Ghost sat on the sand, a silent gray statue, watching his master unload the tools of his trade. This was not a rescue operation. There was no urgency, no racing clock, no life hanging in the balance. There was only the task. He unpacked heavy waterproof Pelican cases, checking the seals on his underwater camera housing. He inspected the hoses on his dive tanks. He laid out his dry suit, his buoyancy compensator, and his heavy utility belt. On the sand, just above the high tide line, he established his base. It was a small, heavy-duty canvas tent, more of a windbreak, where he could store equipment and review his findings. Ghost immediately claimed a spot inside, lying down with his head on his paws, amber eyes fixed on Stephen. Stephen spent 2 hours walking the perimeter of the wreck at low tide, his boots sinking into the wet, packed sand. He carried a digital tablet, taking photographs, making notes on the primary hull breaches, and gauging the stability of the structure. The ship was groaning, a constant low-frequency sound of metal under stress. It was the sound of gravity winning. He ignored it. He was focused on the welds, the rust patterns, the shear lines. He was treating the Odyssey like an equation to be solved. By noon, the chill had seeped deep into his bones. His coffee thermos was empty, and his stomach was hollow. He needed supplies and a hot meal. "Stay here, boy. Watch the gear," he said to Ghost. Ghost's tail thumped once on the sand. He would not move. Stephen drove his truck the 10 minutes into the center of Sea Haven Point. The town was less a town than a single, salt-blasted street clinging to the edge of a small, working harbor. The buildings were faded clapboard, their paint peeling. Fishing boats, not pleasure craft, bobbed at the docks. He found what the sign advertised as the Salty Gull Diner, the only eatery in town. He pushed open the door, a small bell tinkling overhead. The air inside was warm, thick with the smell of old coffee, fried fish, and bacon. It was a classic coastal diner, worn red vinyl booths, a long formica counter, and a handful of patrons. A waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, named Brenda, according to her name tag, nodded at him. "Just one? Seat yourself at the counter, hon." Stephen slid onto a stool, grateful for the warmth. He ordered a black coffee and the fisherman's special, which seemed to be everything fried. At a large booth in the corner, 3 men sat nursing mugs of coffee. They were the genuine article, old-timers in flannel shirts, worn jeans, and suspenders. Their faces were deeply lined from decades of sun and sea. They were the source of the only real conversation in the diner. "She's settled another 5 degrees since yesterday," one of them said, gesturing vaguely toward the coast. "That stern half is going to be gone by the next king tide." "It's the noise that gets me," said another, a man with a thick white beard. "Still gives me a chill. My daddy used to say the sea keeps what it earns. Sounds like she's still angry about that one." Stephen listened, pretending to study the menu. The third man, thin and wiry, chuckled. "That's not the sea. That's the crew's cry. That's what they're calling it. Heard it myself last week. When the tide comes in just right, she wails, like a banshee." "Ah, you're full of it," the bearded man scoffed, though he smiled as he said it. They were mostly talking for their own entertainment. "It's just wind in a broken pipe, that's all." "Wind don't sound like that," the wiry man insisted, leaning in. "It don't moan. It's the souls of all the sailors who went down in these waters. They found a new home in that wreck, and they are singing." The waitress, Brenda, refilled Stephen's mug. "Don't mind them," she said in a low voice. "They like to spook themselves. It's just a broken ship." "You're the fella surveying it, aren't you?" A new voice cut in. Stephen turned. The man who had spoken was not one of the fishermen. He had approached from a back table. He was in his 50s, stocky, with a thick neck and a face that looked perpetually annoyed. He wore a clean, dark blue polo shirt with a small embroidered logo. Sea Haven Point Marina. His dark hair was slicked back, and his eyes were small and shrewd. "I'm Stephen. I'm handling the structural survey," Stephen said evenly. "Mario," the man said, not offering a hand. "I manage the docks, the marina. Basically, I run the port here." He looked Stephen up and down, his gaze lingering. "An insurance job, right? What exactly are they paying you to find?" The question was blunt, the tone probing and suspicious. "Just what I said," Stephen replied, his old training kicking in, keeping his voice flat. "A structural survey, hull integrity, stress fractures, just a report." Mario let out a short, unpleasant laugh. A report, right. And you're hearing all this talk? He waved a dismissive hand at the old fisherman, who had gone quiet. The crew's cry. Bunch of nonsense. Unlike the fisherman who spoke of the legend with a mix of humor and superstition, Mario's dismissal was cold and angry. He seemed personally offended by the topic. Just sounds like compressed air to me, Stephen said, shrugging. Mario leaned in closer, his voice dropping. Look, a word of advice. I don't know what the insurance company told you, but Sea Haven Point is a quiet town. We like it that way. That wreck is an eyesore, and we'll be glad when it's gone. I'm just here to do my job, Mario, Stephen said. Right. Your job. Mario's eyes hardened. Don't go listening to these old fools and their ghost stories, and don't go poking around where you're not needed. It's a broken ship. It's dangerous. People get hurt around wrecks like that. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Do your surface survey. Take your pictures from the beach. Write down that it's a big pile of junk, collect your check, and go home. Easiest money you'll ever make. The friendliness in the diner had vanished. The fishermen were staring into their coffee. Brenda, the waitress, was busy wiping down a perfectly clean counter. This was not a friendly warning. It was a boundary. I'll be sure to file a thorough report, Stephen said quietly. Mario studied him for another long second, as if trying to decide if Stephen was a threat or a fool. Finally, he nodded curtly. You do that. He turned and walked out of the diner, the bell tinkling sharply behind him. Stephen sat for a moment, the heat from his coffee cup suddenly insufficient. He finished his meal in silence, paid his check, and left. He got back in the truck and found Ghost sitting exactly as he had left him, head up, watching the workstation. The dog whined once in greeting, and Stephen scrubbed the thick fur on his neck. Well, boy, he said, starting the engine. Looks like the local hospitality is a little specific. He drove back to the beach. The fog was rolling back in, thickening by the minute. The wreck of the Odyssey slowly disappeared into the white void. The fishermen's ghost stories were just noise, but Mario's warning was different. It was clear, direct, and out of place. Why would a local dock manager care how thorough an insurance survey was? Stephen parked the truck. He was just a surveyor. He was just here to look at the metal, but as he looked at the place where the giant ship had been, he felt a new kind of cold. It was not the memory of the storm. It was the feeling of being watched. The work was slow. Stephen spent the rest of the afternoon meticulously plotting the visible sections of the wreck on a digital grid, cross-referencing them with the insurance manifests. The fog held offshore, but the sky turned a flat, heavy gray that promised a cold night. Mario's warning was a persistent itch in the back of his mind. It was unprofessional. It was wrong. He tried to dismiss it as small-town paranoia, a local strongman protecting his turf, but it left a sour taste. Ghost remained on edge. The dog, usually a picture of placid calm, paced the small perimeter of their canvas workstation. He would stop, lift his nose to the wind, and let out a low, almost inaudible huff. His attention was fixed on the wreck, a silent gray sentinel staring down a fallen giant. It's just a ship, boy, Stephen said, trying to reassure himself as much as the dog. Just steel. As the sun began to dip, the light failed rapidly, not fading so much as being swallowed by the thickening coastal mist. The temperature dropped. Stephen zipped his jacket higher and turned on a heavy-duty battery-powered lantern, casting a pool of harsh white light on his table. And he heard the ocean change. The lazy rhythm of the surf began to quicken. The tide was turning, coming in. The sound of the waves grew deeper, more powerful, as the water began its relentless march back up the beach. The first new sound was mechanical. It was a deep, resonant groan, the sound of immense weight shifting. It was followed by a high-pitched, agonizing screech. Stephen flinched, his pencil stopping on the page. He knew that sound. It was the metal-on-metal noise the fisherman had described. He glanced toward the wreck, now just a massive silhouette in the gloom. "That's it, Ghost," he said, his voice tight. "That's the two halves. The water's lifting them, making them rub together." Chee. It was a logical, expected noise, but it set his nerves on fire. It was the sound of a ship dying. Ghost stood up, his fur bristling. He let out a low, warning growl. "Easy," Stephen commanded, his own heart rate quickening. Then the second sound began. It did not come from the metal. It came from within the metal. It started as a low vibration, a hum that seemed to travel through the wet sand and up into the soles of his boots. Then it grew, taking on a hollow, mournful quality. It was a low-key wail, an ooh that rose in pitch until it sounded like a choir of grieving voices. It was the crew's cry from the legends. Stephen stood bolt upright. His logical mind scrambled for an explanation. Wind. It's just wind blowing through a hole. It's air compressed in the tanks. But the sound was too human. It was too full of despair. The wail crested, blending with another metallic shriek. And in that instant, the beach, the fog, and the wreck of the Odyssey vanished. Stephen was no longer in Oregon. He was in the icy black water of the North Pacific, 4 years in the past. The year 2019. The world was not gray mist. It was a churning, screaming vortex of black water and horizontal rain. The shriek of the Odyssey's hull was the shriek of the wind in his helicopter's rotor blades. The deep groan of the wreck was the groan of the trawler's hull as it tore itself in half on the rocks. And the high, mournful wail of the crew's cry. It was the screaming, the terrified, thin screams of the men he was trying to save, and the one small, piercing cry of the girl. "Carrie!" The name ripped from his throat, but he made no sound. He was paralyzed. He was staring, unseeing, into the dark. His chest was encased in ice. He could not breathe. He could feel the phantom sensation of the rescue harness cutting into his ribs, the impossible, crushing weight of the water. He could feel the small hand, slick with seawater and grease, slipping. Slipping. He was failing. Right now. He was losing her. "Hold on," he tried to yell. "I have you!" But his mouth was clamped shut. He was frozen, a statue of his own failure. Ghost had barked. The sound was distant, as if from another world. When the wail began, Ghost had exploded into action. This was not a familiar sound. This was a threat. He lunged toward the water, planting his feet in the sand and unleashing a series of deep, concussive barks aimed directly at the shadowy wreck. He was challenging the monster in the fog. He was defending his territory and his master. He barked twice, a harsh, guttural sound. Then some canine instinct, some attunement deeper than human understanding, made him stop. The monster was in the fog. But the problem was behind him. He whirled around. In the cold, artificial light of the lantern, he saw Stephen. He saw the rigid posture, the wide, vacant eyes staring at nothing. He saw the hand, clenched at his side, trembling. Ghost knew this man. This was not the calm, methodical master who threw the ball, who packed the gear. This was the other man, the one who cried out in his sleep, the man trapped in the storm. Ghost's entire demeanor shifted in a fraction of a second. The aggression vanished, replaced by an urgent, focused concern. His ears flattened. A soft, anxious whine broke from his throat. He moved to Stephen's side, pressing his solid, warm body hard against his master's thigh. Stephen did not react. He was rigid, lost. Ghost whined again, louder this time, a note of canine panic entering his voice. He pushed his cold, wet nose under Stephen's clenched hand. He nudged it hard. Nothing. The wail from the ship rose again, and Stephen's body tensed even further. Ghost became frantic. This was wrong. His master was lost, and he had to pull him back. He pushed his nose under Stephen's hand again, this time lifting it forcibly. He licked the back of Stephen's hand, a rough, wet, grounding sensation. He nudged his face into Stephen's jacket, whining, demanding to be seen. The sensation cut through the noise, the cold, wet nose, the rough tongue. It was not the icy water of the Pacific. It was Ghost. Stephen's head snapped down. His eyes, wide and terrified, finally focused. He saw the amber eyes of his dog staring up at him, filled with a desperate, loving intelligence. "Ghost!" A ragged gasp tore from Stephen's lungs. The paralysis broke, the strength went out of his legs, and he collapsed, sinking to his knees in the cold, damp sand. He wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in the gray fur of his ruff. Ghost did not pull away. He stood firm, a solid pillar, and began to lick the side of Stephen's face, whining softly, confirming his master was back. Stephen clung to him, shaking violently. The sounds were still there, the metallic groans and the horrific, mournful wail. But they were just sounds again. The spell was broken. The memory had been caged. "It's okay," Stephen whispered, his voice cracking. "It's okay, boy. I'm here. I'm here." He stayed there for a long time, anchored by the solid, living warmth of his companion, the only thing that had ever been able to pull him back from the storm. Ghost had saved him, just as he had saved him a dozen times before. Slowly, Stephen got his breathing under control. He finally pulled back, his hands still gripping the dog's fur. "Good boy," he breathed. Ghost looked at him, then turned his head, staring back into the dark toward the Odyssey. The wailing continued. A low growl rumbled deep in the German shepherd's chest. Stephen was back, but the threat was still there. Ghost did not trust that ship. Stephen did not sleep. After the episode on the beach, he and Ghost had retreated to the cabin. He sat in the dark, the single-bar electric heater casting a weak red glow on the floor, and just listened. He listened to the storm of his own pulse subside. He listened to the steady, rhythmic breathing of Ghost, who had taken up a protective position at his feet. Outside, the Odyssey continued its terrible concert. The wails and groans rose and fell with the tide, a 4-hour performance of manufactured grief. But with the arrival of the cold, gray dawn, the fear of the night receded, and something else took its place. Anger. Stephen was furious. He was furious at the ship for its auditory tricks, furious at his own mind for its fragility, and furious at the memory of Mario for trying to keep him away. He had been a professional rescue specialist for 2 decades. He understood physics. He understood pressure, water displacement, and stress loads on metal. He would not be haunted by a pile of rust. He would not be driven off this beach by a ghost story, least of all one that lived in his own head. He drank his coffee standing up, his movements sharp and deliberate. He was no longer just a surveyor. He was an investigator, determined to find the source. "All right, Ghost," he said, pulling on his heavy-duty boots. "The show's over. Let's find out who's pulling the strings." Ghost, sensing the shift in Stephen's demeanor from fear to focused determination, seemed to relax slightly. His tail gave a single, solid thump. He was ready. They arrived at the beach work tent. The tide was out, the sand a wide, flat expanse of damp silence. The Odyssey was quiet, resting in the mud. Stephen's first target was the metal shriek. This, his rational mind told him, was the simpler of the 2 sounds. He had already surmised the cause, but he needed to confirm it. He set up a digital video camera on a tripod, aimed at the break, the catastrophic point where the ship had torn in 2. He then consulted his tide chart. The water would begin to turn in precisely 45 minutes. While he waited, he unpacked a piece of equipment that looked like a small satellite dish with a microphone at its center, a parabolic sound amplifier. He used it in structural surveys to listen for the subtle sounds of metal fatigue. Today, he would use it to hunt a ghost. Ghost sat beside him, his gaze sweeping the beach, his body alert. The tide turned. The water began its silent, creeping advance. As the first shallow waves lapped at the stern section of the wreck, it began. A low, guttural groan. Stephen watched through his binoculars, his eye glued to the break. The water level rose. The massive, multi-ton stern piece, which was mostly submerged, began to gain buoyancy. It lifted, only by a few inches, but it was enough. Screech! The sound of rust-caked steel grinding against rust-caked steel was deafening, a noise that set his teeth on edge. "Got it," Stephen said aloud. The stern half was floating just enough to rise and fall with the waves, rubbing against the grounded bow section like a monstrous rusted hinge. Mystery number 1 solved. He checked it off a list in his mind. But that was the easy part. That was just noise. The wail, the cry, was the thing that had broken him. He picked up the parabolic microphone. "Come on, boy." He and Ghost began to walk the length of the wreck, staying just above the advancing tide line. The ship was still mostly quiet. The wail, he recalled, had only started when the tide was much higher. This meant the source was not at the bottom of the hull. It was higher up. They patrolled for an hour, the water now swirling around their ankles. The groaning and screeching was constant. Then it began. The low, rising "oh." Stephen stopped. He aimed the microphone at the center of the hull. The sound was loud but diffuse. "Where, Ghost? Where is it coming from?" Ghost was already ahead of him. The dog was standing near a section of the hull that was listing heavily, his head cocked, ears twitching. He was focused not on the ship as a whole, but on a specific spot 20 feet up its side. Stephen followed the dog's gaze. There, just visible, was a series of small, dark circles, a row of portholes, half submerged. The wail grew louder. "Ooh!" Stephen aimed the microphone. The sound in his headphones became sharp, focused, and overwhelming. It was not a chorus of voices. It was one single, powerful note. He lowered the dish, his mind racing. He was a rescue swimmer. He understood this. It was physics, simple, elegant, terrifying physics. The tide was rising. Water was pouring into the breaches at the bottom of the hull, flooding the massive empty cargo holds and interior compartments. But the holds were not truly empty. They were full of air. As the water level inside the ship rose, the air trapped above it was being squeezed. It was being compressed by the weight of thousands of tons of seawater. This massive, pressurized pocket of air had to go somewhere. It was escaping. It was being forced at tremendous velocity through the only available openings, that row of small portholes. The Odyssey was not a haunted house. It was a colossal broken steam whistle, a pipe organ played by the tide. Stephen started to laugh. It was a short, sharp bark of a laugh full of relief. "It's just air, Ghost," he said, clapping the dog on the shoulder. "It's just a damn whistle." The relief was profound. It washed over him, a warm countercurrent to the icy memory of the night before. The ship was no longer a supernatural entity. It was just a machine, a broken, noisy machine. He had his explanation. He could put it in his report. He believed the eerie mystery was over. He spent another hour taking measurements, confirming his theory, his confidence restored. The professional in him had won. As the tide peaked, the wailing subsided. The compartments were full. The pressure was equalized. The ship fell silent, save for the lapping of the waves. Stephen packed his equipment into the tent, feeling lighter than he had in years. The psychological weight of the place had lifted. He turned to his companion. "All right, boy, let's go get some lunch. We earned it." But Ghost was not looking at him. The dog was standing at the edge of the tent, completely rigid, staring at the Odyssey. "Ghost, come on, it's over," Stephen said. Ghost did not move. He was not looking at the portholes. He was not looking at the break in the hull. His gaze was fixed on a section of the ship farther down the beach, a part of the hull that was low, dark, and mostly buried in the sand. The wail was gone, but Ghost's intense, wary focus remained. A low whine came from the dog's throat. He took a few steps toward the wreck, sniffed the air, and then looked back at Stephen, his expression filled with an unmistakable, urgent warning. Stephen's relief began to fade, replaced by a new, cold curiosity. He had solved the mystery of the sound, but Ghost, he realized, was sensing something else entirely. Stephen's relief was a bright, warm light, and he did not want it to dim. He had faced the Ghost and discovered it was just physics, a machine sighing in its sleep. He had his answer. The job was simple again. "It's over, boy," he said again, trying to project calm. He zipped up the canvas tent flap. "The sound is gone because the tide is full. Let's go home. Cabin. Food." Ghost did not move. He stood just outside the tent, a statue of gray and white fur, his head high. His gaze was locked on a section of the Odyssey's hull that was now deep underwater. The dog's body was a coiled spring of tension. "Ghost, heel." Stephen's voice was firm. Ghost turned his head, looked at Stephen, and let out a low, unhappy whine. He obeyed the command, walking slowly to Stephen's side, but his compliance was reluctant. As they got in the truck, Ghost did not settle. He stared out the rear window at the wreck until it was consumed by the fog. Back at the cabin, the atmosphere was thick. Stephen tried to relax, to read his survey notes, but he could not. Ghost would not settle. He paced the small room from the door to the window, his claws ticking an anxious rhythm on the wooden floor. "What is it?" Stephen finally asked, dropping his notebook. "The sound is gone. We figured it out." Ghost stopped pacing and looked at him. He seemed to vibrate with an energy that Stephen could not understand. It was not fear. It was insistence. Stephen slept poorly, the dog's restlessness infecting him. He awoke before dawn, the cabin cold. Ghost was already sitting by the door, waiting. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" Stephen stated. It was not a question. He made coffee, his mind working. The dog's behavior was not random. Ghost was a German shepherd, bred for intelligence, focus, and task completion. He had been trained not just for obedience, but for scent work. In his former life, Stephen had sometimes worked with canine units. He knew what a focused dog looked like. Ghost was focused. "Okay," Stephen said, pulling on his boots. "Okay, boy, show me." They arrived at the beach in the pre-dawn light. The tide was at its lowest point. The ocean had pulled back hundreds of yards, exposing a vast dark plain of mud, rock, and kelp. The Odyssey lay beached and silent, fully exposed. This time, Stephen did not go to the tent. He simply stood by the truck. "Show me." He unclipped Ghost's leash. The dog did not run. He moved with purpose. He trotted down the beach, his paws making wet prints in the sand. He did not go toward the portholes. He did not go toward the broken middle section. He went directly to the spot he had been staring at yesterday, a low listing section of the hull near the stern. This part of the ship was usually submerged. Now it was exposed, a massive wall of red, rusted steel tilted at a sharp angle. It was buried deep in the sand and mud. As Stephen approached, Ghost's behavior intensified. He began to whine, a high, piercing sound of agitation. He ran up to the hull, sniffed at the base where the steel met the sand, and then recoiled, sneezing. "What, boy? What is it?" Stephen said, his voice low. Ghost looked back at him, barked once, a sharp, urgent command, and then began to dig with frantic paws. His paws moved with frantic speed, sending clumps of dark, wet sand flying. He was trying to get under the hull. "Ghost, stop! You'll cut yourself." Stephen moved forward, grabbing the dog's collar. Ghost resisted, pulling against him, trying to get back to the spot. His eyes were wild. Stephen looked at what the dog had been digging at. It was not just the hull. It was a perfectly rectangular shape, at least 10 feet wide and 20 feet tall. It was a massive, sealed cargo hatch. And it was not meant to be opened. Stephen's eyes traced the edges. Unlike the clean, precise factory welds of the rest of the ship, the seams of this hatch were thick, sloppy, and crude. It had been sealed shut. Recently. This isn't standard," he murmured. He looked closer. At the bottom corner, where Ghost had been digging, a tiny, dark, oily substance was weeping from a pinprick hole in the bad weld. It was barely a trickle. He knelt, his glove hovering over the substance. He could smell it now. It was not the familiar briny smell of the sea. It was a faint, acrid chemical smell. Ghost whined again, frantic. And in that moment, Stephen understood. He stood up and looked at his dog, his heart pounding. Ghost was not just obsessed with a strange smell. He was not just curious. Last night, in the dark, the ship had cried. That sound had triggered Stephen's trauma, sending him into a waking nightmare. And Ghost had known. Ghost had pulled him back. Now, in the light, Ghost had found the source. His superior canine senses had done what Stephen's human logic could not. He had followed the sound, the vibrations, and now the scent to its origin. The dog had linked the tieng koch, the sound that had tormented his master, to this specific sealed hatch. To Ghost, this was not just a piece of metal. This was the dark, hollow heart of the monster. This was the source of the pain. This was the bad place that had hurt his master. His behavior was purely protective. You knew, Stephen whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You knew it came from here. Ghost stopped pulling and looked up at him, panting, his gray fur matted with wet sand. His eyes were clear. Yes, this is it. This is the bad place. The relief Stephen had felt yesterday was gone, replaced by a new, cold dread. The fisherman's ghost stories were wrong, but Mario's warning at the diner suddenly felt chillingly real. Don't go poking around where you're not needed. Do your surface survey and go home. Mario had not been worried about a ghost. He had been worried about this. Stephen knelt and put his forehead against Ghost's. The dog licked his cheek. Okay, boy, I understand, Stephen said, his voice hard. I'm not scared of it anymore. He stood up and faced the hatch. His professional curiosity was now fused with a cold anger. He was no longer a surveyor. He was no longer a victim of his past. He was the man who was going to open this door. Trust. It was a word Stephen had not applied to much of anything since 2019. He trusted his gear because he maintained it. He trusted the tide charts because they were science. He trusted Ghost. That was the beginning and the end of the list. Now, kneeling in the cold, wet sand, the acrid, unfamiliar scent stinging his nostrils, he put his full trust in the animal beside him. Okay, boy, Stephen said, his voice low and steady. He gave Ghost a firm rub on the neck. You found it. You did your job. Now let me do mine. Ghost seemed to understand. The frantic energy left him, replaced by a low, watchful stillness. He sat back on his haunches, his silver-gray fur stark against the dark, rusted steel. His eyes were fixed on the hatch, a silent partner in the investigation. Stephen stood up and went back to his truck, his mind clicking into a gear he had not used in years. This was no longer a structural survey. This was a scene. He pulled on a pair of heavy-duty work gloves and grabbed his main diagnostic case. He returned to the hatch and began his examination. The tide was still at its lowest point, but he knew he only had an hour, perhaps two, before the sea returned to reclaim this secret. First, he photographed the hatch from every angle, the high-definition lens capturing what his eyes had already told him. This was not a factory-issue component. He ran his gloved hand over the weld. A standard shipbuilder's weld, done in a dry dock, was a work of art, a clean, precise, uniform stack of dimes. This was a monstrosity. It was thick, globular, and sloppy, like molten metal had been poured carelessly into a trench. It was pockmarked with slag and impurities. This was done in a hurry, he murmured to himself, and not by a professional. Or perhaps by a professional who was paid to be fast, not clean. He took his survey hammer, a small specialized tool for testing steel integrity, and tapped the weld. It returned a dull, solid thud. He tapped the hull plate next to it, a clearer, ringing ping. The difference in density was obvious. This was a thick, crude patch. This was clearly an act of concealment. He walked the perimeter of the hatch, measuring it. 20 feet tall, 10 feet wide. He pulled out his waterproof tablet, the one loaded with the Odyssey's official schematics and build plans. He located their position on the ship. According to the blueprint, there was supposed to be a standard bolt-down access plate here. Hatch 3C. It was meant for maintenance, designed to be unbolted and removed. What he was looking at was a prison door. Someone had taken the original hatch and welded it shut, completely and permanently, fusing it to the hull. Why? He knelt again at the corner where Ghost had been digging, near the pinprick hole. The chemical smell was stronger here. He had to know what was inside. He took a heavy-duty pry bar from his kit and wedged the tip into a gap where the weld was sloppiest. He put his full weight on it. The bar bowed under the strain, and a few chips of slag broke off, but the hatch itself did not budge. It was sealed as tight as a tomb. He hit the steel plate with the flat of his hammer. It was solid, at least an inch thick. A cold realization settled over him. His tools were for observation. They were for measuring and testing. They were useless against this. He needed professional tools. To get through this, he would need power. He would need heat. He would need a thermal lance, an oxy-arc cutting torch, a broco, equipment that could generate thousands of degrees to melt steel. Equipment he absolutely did not have. Equipment that a simple structural surveyor would have no reason to possess. His frustration was a physical bitter taste in his mouth. He was staring at a locked door with no key, and the tide was already beginning to turn. He could hear the first distant whispers of the surf beginning its return. He stepped back, breathing hard, not from exertion, but from a sudden, cold anger. His mind replayed the last 48 hours, the creepy legends in the diner, the hostile, specific warning from Mario. Do your surface survey. Don't go poking around. And then the sound. The tieng koch. He looked up at the portholes, visible farther up the hull. That was the ship's voice. He looked down at the hatch. This was its secret. The compressed air whistling through the holes was just a symptom. The pressure was building because this hatch was sealed. The air that was supposed to vent through a normal system was trapped, forcing its way out through tiny portholes. The ship was screaming because someone had sealed its mouth shut. His determination solidified. His jaw tightened. The fear he had felt in the dark, the raw, paralyzing panic, was replaced by a different kind of energy. A cold, hard clarity. This was not just a job. This was not just a mystery. This was wrong. Someone had done this. Someone had deliberately, crudely, and effectively hidden something in the belly of this ship. And then, the ship had wrecked. What had been a private secret was now a ticking time bomb, weeping chemicals into the sand, just waiting for the sea to finish tearing it open. He thought of Carrie. He thought of the violent, indifferent power of the ocean, of the storms that took lives. But this was not the sea. This was not an act of nature. This was human. This was greed. This was the kind of malicious negligence that caused the disasters he had spent his life fighting. This was no longer just a survey job. It was a secret that needed to be exposed. His mission was no longer to write a report. His mission was to open that hatch. He began to pack his diagnostic kit, his movements swift and sure. The tide was coming, and he was out of time for today. But this was not over. He looked at Ghost, who was watching him, the dog's intelligent eyes reflecting his own newfound resolve. "He was right to warn me," Stephen said, his voice a low growl. "Mario, he wasn't worried about the town's reputation. He was worried about me. He was worried I'd find this." He snapped the case shut. He knew what he had to do. Astoria was a 3-hour drive. It was a major port city. It had commercial diving supply shops. He would get the tools. He would rent them, buy them, whatever it took. He would come back, and he would cut that door open. "Come on, boy," Stephen said, striding back toward the truck. Ghost fell into step beside him. The human and the dog walked in perfect sync, leaving the silent, sealed wreck to the returning tide. The fog was rolling in, but for the first time since he had arrived, Stephen's mind was perfectly clear. The drive to Astoria was a silent 3-hour pilgrimage of resolve. Stephen left Ghost at the cabin, a decision that pained both of them. The dog whined, pacing the length of the small room, his eyes locked on Stephen with an almost human understanding of abandonment. "It's not safe for you, boy," Stephen said, his hand on the dog's head. "This next part, this is my job. You did yours. You found the door. I'll be back." Ghost sat, but his body trembled with anxious energy. The highway north cut through the dense, rain-soaked forests of the Oregon coast. Stephen drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He was no longer a drifter. He was a man with a purpose, and the feeling was both familiar and terrifying. He was moving toward a problem, not away from it. Astoria was a city of bridges, built on a steep hill overlooking the massive Columbia River. It was a proper port, full of real maritime industry. He found what he was looking for near the docks, a commercial diving supply warehouse, its corrugated metal walls stained with rust. The man inside, a grizzled veteran with a face like a worn-out boot, sized Stephen up. "Need to rent a Broco," Stephen said, no preamble. "Full setup, oxygen, rods, and a power supply." The man nodded, recognizing a professional. "Going long?" "Just need to make one cut. A big one," Stephen replied. He paid the hefty deposit in cash. An hour later, the back of his truck was loaded with 2 high-pressure oxygen tanks, a heavy-duty marine battery, coiled hoses, and the torch itself. An oxy-arc cutting torch. He was committed. The act of renting the tool felt like crossing a final line. He drove the 3 hours back to Sea Haven Point, his mind a quiet, cold engine of calculation. He had to wait. For 2 days, he and Ghost were prisoners of the weather and the tide. A coastal squall blew in, churning the surf into a violent, muddy foam. Diving was impossible. Stephen paced the cabin, cleaning his gear, checking the seals on his dry suit, and watching the dog. Ghost was his barometer, pacing when Stephen paced, sleeping when Stephen sat, a perfect mirror of his master's coiled tension. Then, on the 3rd morning, the storm broke. The sky was a pale, flat white, and the sea, though still powerful, had lost its chaotic anger. The tide chart promised a deep, long, low tide. It was time. They arrived at the beach. Stephen backed the truck down the sand, farther than he ever had before. Ghost jumped out, his feet sinking into the wet, packed surface. "Okay, boy, you're security," Stephen said, his voice tight with adrenaline. "You watch the truck. You watch the path. You bark if you see anything. Understood?" Ghost sat, his gaze fixed on the dirt track behind them. He understood the command. Stephen worked like a man possessed. He hauled the heavy tanks and the battery down to the water's edge, positioning them on a patch of exposed rock near the sealed hatch. He suited up, the dry suit, the heavy tanks on his back, the weight belt. Each piece was a familiar comfort, a suit of armor. He sealed his mask, leaving it on his head. Finally, he picked up his dive helmet, which was equipped with a high-definition, waterproof video camera. He pressed the record button. A small red light glowed. He was documenting his work. If Mario or his friends showed up, if something went wrong, there would be a record. He looked at Ghost. "Watch my back, buddy." He put on the helmet, sealed it, and opened the valve on his tank. The world contracted to the sound of his own breathing, the rhythmic, mechanical hiss-click-hiss of the regulator. He picked up the Broco torch and its heavy cables and walked into the surf. The water was shockingly cold, a brutal slap that stole his breath for a moment. He submerged and began to kick, descending into the murky, green-brown world. Visibility was less than 5 feet. The water was a murky, green-brown world. He did not need to see. He knew where the hatch was. He swam down, following the massive curve of the hull until his gloved hand touched the rough, sloppy weld. He was in a chasm. The space was narrow and claustrophobic. The tilted hull of the Odyssey loomed over him like a falling mountain, and the sea floor was a dark, muddy slope below. He grounded himself, his fins digging into the sand. He checked his gauges. He had enough air. He had the tool. He raised the torch, pressed the ignition switch, and struck the arc. A blinding, furious cone of white-hot light erupted, turning the dark water into a boiling, brilliant inferno. The sound was a violent, screaming hiss that tore through the quiet of the ocean. And in that instant, his mind broke. The sound, the hiss of the torch was the hiss of the storm. The violent rush of bubbles past his mask was the sea foam choking him. The confined space, the pressure of the water on his chest, the shadow of the hull above. It was the trawler. It was the storm of 2019. His breathing, the calm, rhythmic hiss-click, suddenly became a frantic, desperate gasp. Hiss, 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 hiss. He was hyperventilating. His air gauge dipped. Panic. No, not here. He had to fight his own terror. He dropped the torch. It fell into the mud, still burning, a furious, guttering eye. He squeezed his own eyes shut inside the mask. Stop. Breathe. You are not there. He forced his lungs to slow. Inhale. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Exhale. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. He was Stephen. He was at Sea Haven Point. The year was 2025. He was not saving Carrie. He opened his eyes. The torch was sputtering in the mud. He picked it up. His panic was still there, a cold animal in his gut. But his anger was hotter, the anger he had felt in the cabin. The anger at the sloppy weld, at Mario's threat, at the chemical smell. The anger at the lie. He thought of Ghost sitting on the beach, trusting him. He raised the torch again, his hand shaking, not with fear, but with fury. He would not be broken by this. He would break it. He jammed the tip of the rod against the steel. He began to cut. He was not a surveyor. He was not a victim. He was a weapon. He cut with a savage precision. The torch melted the steel like butter, sending showers of white-hot slag into the darkness. He cut up, then across, then down, forming a large triangle. His arms burned from the effort. His lungs screamed for air, but he did not stop. The panic was still there, but he was using it. He was feeding it into the torch. He was almost done. One final push. He completed the cut. With a terrible, low-pitched groan that he felt in his chest, the triangular section of steel, 10 feet tall, gave way. It tore from the hull and fell inward, disappearing into the pitch-black, water-filled void inside the ship. Stephen ripped the torch away. He stared into the hole he had created. A plume of thick, oily black bubbles, tinged with a chemical rainbow, erupted from the opening and rushed past his mask. The way was open. The water inside the wreck was a different world. Outside, the ocean was a living, breathing thing of currents and light. Here, it was a stagnant, silent tomb. Stephen hung in the darkness, his own breathing echoing too loudly in his helmet. The plume of chemical bubbles had dissipated, but the acrid smell was now thick in his regulator, a metallic taste on his tongue. He switched on his powerful, helmet-mounted dive light. The beam cut a sharp white cone through the blackness, illuminating a universe of floating silt. The red recording light on his helmet was a small, steady companion. He was a witness. He pulled himself through the jagged, triangular hole he had cut. The edges of the steel were still warm to the touch, even through his gloves. His light beam swept the interior. He was in a massive, flooded cargo hold. And it was full. They were stacked 3 high, secured by thick cargo netting that swayed gently in the water displaced by his entry. 55-gallon drums, hundreds of them, all painted a dark, unassuming blue. He kicked slowly, moving deeper into the hold. The silence was absolute. He was the only living thing in this steel graveyard. His light beam scanned the rows. Then it landed on a label. He swam closer, bracing himself against a bulkhead. He wiped a thick layer of slime from the side of a drum. The camera on his helmet focused, capturing the image. The label was professionally printed, bright white and green. It read, "Sea Green Organic Fertilizer, 100% natural. Handle with care." Fertilizer? A lie. A blatant, lazy lie. You do not weld an access hatch shut to protect fertilizer. You do not risk this kind of wreck for fertilizer. He followed the chemical taste, the faint trail in the water. He moved toward the wall of the hull, near the hole he had made. And he found it. One of the drums, likely damaged when the ship first ran aground, had been punctured by an internal support beam. It was leaking. A slow, viscous, oily substance, darker than the water, wept from the gash. This was the source. This was what Ghost had smelled. He had come prepared. From a D-ring on his utility belt, he unclipped a small, sterile, high-pressure sampling vial. He carefully unscrewed the cap, held the vial to the stream of dark liquid, and watched as it filled. He sealed it tight. He had it. The proof. He clipped the vial back to his belt, the evidence secure. He hovered in the dark, the light from his helmet illuminating the endless, silent rows of poison. And he felt it. Not triumph, not relief. A cold, pure, clarifying rage. It was a fury that started in his gut and radiated outward, burning away the last lingering tendrils of his panic. The fear he had felt just moments before, the claustrophobia, the memory of the storm, it all seemed pathetic now, insignificant in the face of this. This was not an accident. This was a conspiracy. His mind assembled the pieces, assembled the Odyssey hadn't just run aground. It was almost certain she was scuttled. The crew had run her onto the rocks during the storm, using the weather as the perfect cover. They had planned to sink her, to let the ocean swallow their secret. They would collect the insurance money for the ship, and the fertilizer, and this toxic payload would be buried forever in the deep. But they had failed. The ship hadn't sunk properly. It had broken in two, leaving this cargo hold exposed. He thought of the men he had pulled from the water over the years. The fishermen on trawlers that had bad luck, their safety equipment old, their hulls uninspected. He thought of Carrie. That trawler in 2019. It should never have left port. The investigation later found the owner had cut corners on hull maintenance for years. The storm had just been the catalyst. This was the same thing. This was the source. This was the quiet, boardroom-level greed that killed people. This was the signature of men who sat in clean offices and signed manifests, trading lives they would never see for profits they would. They cut corners, they faked labels, they dumped poison. And men like him, men like the crew of his old helicopter, they were the ones who flew into the storms caused by this greed. They were the ones who had to clean up the mess, who had to pull the bodies from the water. The hand he remembered, Carrie's hand, slipping from his grasp. It was not the storm that had taken her. It was this quiet, calculated human evil. His breathing in the regulator was no longer panicked. It was slow, cold, and steady. He was no longer a victim of the past. He was a witness. He checked his air gauge. The panic attack and the cut had consumed a dangerous amount of air. He was deep in the red. It was time to go. He turned, the sample vial tapping securely against his hip. He backed out of the jagged hole into the murky green of the open sea. He began his ascent, a slow, methodical climb to the surface. He did not rush. He was a professional. He would not let them make him a casualty, too. He broke the surface. The gray, flat sky was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He ripped his helmet and mask off, gasping the cold, clean, salt air. He heard a frantic, joyous bark. Ghost was at the water's edge, dancing on his front paws, whining and barking, his entire body racked with relief. Stephen stumbled out of the surf, his gear weighing him down like an anchor. He dropped the torch on the sand and fell to his knees. "I got it, boy," he breathed. "I got it." Ghost was all over him, licking his face, whining, pushing his head into his chest. Stephen grabbed the dog's thick ruff, grounding himself in the living, loyal warmth. "It's okay. I'm okay. We're okay." It took him 20 minutes to get his gear off. His hands were shaking, not with fear, but with adrenaline and rage. He methodically stripped off the dry suit, the tanks, the weight belt. He carefully placed the helmet, its camera still blinking, into its protective case. He put the precious sample vial in a separate, padded box. He loaded the heavy Bronco equipment back onto the truck. His movements were efficient. The job was done. He walked to the driver's side door, exhausted but victorious. He reached for the handle, and then he stopped. Something was wrong. The truck was leaning. He looked down. The front driver's side tire was completely flat, pressed against the sand. It was not a slow leak. He knelt, 3 long parallel cuts scoring the sidewall. The rubber was peeled back. It had been done with a long, sharp knife. A cold shock, colder than the ocean, went through him. They had been here, while he was in the water, while he was in the ship. They had been on this beach. He stood up, his head snapping toward the cliffs, the dunes, the access path. There was no one, just the sound of the wind and the gulls. Ghost was at his side, a growl rumbling deep in his chest. The dog was staring, not at the tire, but at the path, his ears flat, his teeth bared. They had been watched. Mario, the men from the marina. They had seen him rent the tools. They had seen him go in, and they had left him this message. Stephen looked at the slashed tire. He looked at the sample box in the truck bed. He looked at Ghost. His cold fury settled into something harder, something unbreakable. "Too late," he said, his voice a low rasp. He walked to the back of the truck to get the jack and the spare. They had just confirmed everything. The knife cuts on the tire were deep, precise, and professional. This was not vandalism. It was a message. The warning, however, had the exact opposite of its intended effect. The cold, crawling fear of being watched was burned away by a sudden, clarifying heat. The rage he had felt inside the hull was now a shield. They were too late. Ghost was still growling, a low thoracic rumble, his eyes fixed on the empty dunes. "I know, boy," Stephen said, his voice flat. "They were here." He went to the back of the truck. Changing a tire on solid asphalt is an inconvenience. Changing a heavy-duty truck tire on wet, sloping sand, alone, is a grueling 20-minute battle. He worked with a furious, methodical energy. The jack slipped twice in the soft sand. He swore, not with panic, but with effort. Every turn of the lug wrench was a promise. He finally muscled the spare tire into place and threw the slashed tire into the truck bed. He loaded the last of the Broco equipment, his movements economical. He secured the box with the sample and the case with the camera. He got into the cab, Ghost jumping in beside him. He drove off the beach, the truck's engine roaring as it fought for traction. He did not look back. He did not go to the cabin. He did not pass go. He drove the 3 hours north to Portland in a state of hyper-focused calm. The forests of the coast blurred past, a green tunnel. He was a man with a mission, and the feeling was so familiar, it ached. This was what he had been before 2019. He found an independent environmental analytics lab in an industrial park on the outskirts of the city. He walked in, holding the padded box with the sample vial. A lab tech, a young woman with safety glasses and a white coat, looked up. "I need a full-spectrum analysis on this," Stephen said, placing the vial on the counter. "I need to know exactly what's in it. It's a water sample." "Okay," she said, pulling up a form. "Standard turnaround is 5 to 7 business." "I need it in 3 hours," Stephen said. He pulled his wallet out and laid several $100 bills on the counter. "I will pay for the rush, whatever it takes." The tech looked at the cash, then at Stephen's face. She saw the deadly seriousness in his eyes. She saw the salt crust on his jacket and the grease on his hands. She nodded. "I'll have to run it as a Priority 1 toxic. It will be expensive." "Just send the full report to this email address," Stephen said, writing it down. "As soon as you have it." He left the lab and spent the next 3 hours in a generic coffee shop, his laptop open, his back to the wall. He downloaded the footage from the helmet camera. It was crystal clear, damning, and terrifying. He watched himself swim through the dark, the light beam landing on the fertilizer labels. His phone buzzed, an email. It was a PDF from the lab. The report was dense with chemical terms, but the summary was clear. Tetrachlorobenzene and dioxin compounds. Extremely toxic, carcinogenic, and prohibited from marine transport under... He saved the file. He now had everything. He drove back to Sea Haven Point, the setting sun a fiery red smear in his rearview mirror. He felt no triumph, only a heavy, cold weight. He had the truth. Now he had to use it. He arrived at the cabin well after dark. Ghost immediately jumped out and did a quick defensive perimeter of the small building, sniffing the air, his body low. He returned to the porch and sat, watching the darkness. Stephen went inside. He turned on his laptop, but not the lights. He uploaded the video file. He attached the lab report. He composed a new email. The recipient was the regional director of the Environmental Protection Agency. He CC'd the main investigative desk of the Oregonian newspaper. The subject line read, "Evidence of illegal toxic dumping, MV Odyssey wreck." He wrote a short professional summary of his findings. Then he saved the email as a draft and set up a scheduled send for 8:00 a.m. the following morning. His dead man switch was set. He sat in the dark drinking cold coffee and waited. He did not have to wait long. At 10:17 p.m., headlights swept across his window. A heavy-duty truck, the same one he had seen Mario driving, pulled into his narrow dirt driveway, blocking the exit. On the porch, Ghost stood up, his fur bristling. He did not bark. He let out a low, menacing growl that seemed to vibrate the very air. The truck doors opened. 3 figures emerged. The first was Mario, his stocky frame silhouetted by the headlights. The other 2 were large, threatening men. They were not from the diner. These were imported. One was tall and built like a refrigerator. The other was shorter but thick, with the unmistakable cauliflower ears of a fighter. They were pure muscle. Stephen opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch, standing in the shadows. Ghost moved to his side, planting himself between Stephen and the men. The dog's growl was louder now, a clear, deadly warning. "That's a nasty-looking dog you got there," Mario said, trying to sound casual. He stopped 20 feet away. The 2 large men fanned out behind him. "He's protective," Stephen said, his voice quiet. "Yeah, well, we're just here to talk," Mario said. "My friends and I, we were just concerned. You've been working awful hard, taking drives to Portland, renting heavy equipment. We were worried you might be in over your head." "I'm fine," Stephen said. "See, I don't think you are," Mario said, his voice losing its false friendliness. "I think you're tired. I think you're stressed. I think you need a vacation. In fact, I think you should pack up your truck, take your dog, and leave Sea Haven Point tonight." The tall man cracked his knuckles, a sound that snapped in the cold night air. Stephen stood perfectly still. He was not armed. He was outnumbered. And he was completely in control, his voice quiet and steady. "I don't think I'll be doing that, Mario," he said. "That wasn't a request." Mario took a step forward. Ghost lunged to the end of the porch, his teeth bared, a savage bark exploding from his chest. Mario and his men froze. They were not afraid of Stephen. They were afraid of the 60-pound wolf who looked ready to rip their throats out. "Call him off," Mario snapped. "He stays," Stephen said, "and you stay right where you are." He held up his cell phone. The screen cast a blue glow on his face. "So you can hear me clearly," Stephen said, his voice calm but projecting. "My phone has been recording this entire conversation since your truck pulled in. But that's the least of your problems." He took a step forward into the edge of the light. Ghost stayed at his side, a rumbling engine of fury. "At 800 tomorrow morning," Stephen said, his voice cutting through the night, "an email is scheduled to be sent to the EPA and the Oregonian. That email contains the full, unedited, high-definition video from my dive inside that hull. It shows the sealed hatch, the barrels, and the fake labels. Attached to that email is a full chemical analysis from a certified lab in Portland, identifying the contents as a highly toxic and prohibited industrial solvent." There was a long, terrible silence, broken only by Ghost's growl and the distant surf. Mario and his men were beaten. They knew it. Their only weapon was physical, and Stephen had just made it obsolete. Mario stared at Stephen, his face a mask of hatred and defeat. The tall man looked at Mario. "This ain't what we signed up for, boss." The shorter man was already backing toward the truck. "What do you want?" Mario whispered. "Get in your truck," Stephen said, his voice like ice. "Get off this property, and tell your bosses they're going to get a phone call. From me." Mario stood there for a second longer, then turned, defeated. He and his men climbed back into the truck. The engine roared, the truck reversed, and it sped off down the dirt track, disappearing into the night. Stephen stood on the porch for a full minute, his adrenaline so high he was shaking. He sank down onto the top step and put his face in his hands. Ghost's demeanor changed instantly. The growling stopped. He whined softly and nudged his cold nose under Stephen's arm, pressing his body close. Stephen wrapped his arm around the dog. "Good boy," he whispered. "Good boy, Ghost. It's okay." He sat there, anchored by his dog, until his heart stopped pounding. Then he stood up, walked back inside the cabin, and closed the door. He sat at his laptop. He had the upper hand. He looked up the parent corporation of the shipping line that owned the Odyssey. He found the number for their corporate legal department. He picked up his phone and began to dial. Stephen's finger hovered over the call button. It was 10:30 p.m. He was about to make a call that would, in no uncertain terms, end his life as he knew it. He looked at Ghost. The dog sat at his feet, the picture of calm, his head resting on Stephen's knee. The quiet, solid pressure was all the courage he needed. He pressed the button. The call went to a late-night legal services voicemail for the multinational shipping conglomerate. Stephen spoke, his voice as cold and clear as the deep ocean. "My name is Stephen. I am an independent surveyor at Sea Haven Point, Oregon, site of your wreck, the MV Odyssey. I have acquired definitive proof of a Class 1 environmental crime. This includes high-definition video of the cargo in sealed hold 3C and a certified lab analysis of the contents. My evidence is scheduled to be delivered to the EPA and the Oregonian newspaper at 0800 tomorrow morning. You have my phone number. I suggest someone with the authority to make decisions call me before then." He hung up. He did not sleep. He sat in the dark, watching the clock, drinking coffee, and stroking Ghost's head. The call came at 4:17 a.m. The caller ID was blocked. "Mr. Stephen," a new voice said. It was not a thug. It was not a local manager. This voice was sharp, smooth, and expensive. It was the voice of a man who owned skyscrapers. "I'm listening," Stephen said. "I am the general counsel for the corporation. We understand you have concerns. We want to make this right. I am authorized to offer you a significant sum, a finder's fee for your discretion, $500,000, wire transferred by sunrise." The air was still. Stephen looked at Ghost. He thought of Mario's threats. He thought of the slashed tire. "No," Stephen said. A pause. The lawyer was not used to no. "$1 million. Mr. Stephen, that is my final offer. Take it, and this all goes away." "You still think I'm negotiating?" Stephen said, his voice flat. What is this, then?" the lawyer asked, his professional calm finally cracking. "This is me telling you what happens next." Stephen stood up and began to pace the small cabin, the phone pressed to his ear. "I don't want your money," he said, his voice a low, hard rasp. "You are going to fix what you broke." "I don't follow." "First," Stephen said, "you will send a real professional hazmat team to Sea Haven Point, not thugs, not locals. You will finance a full, transparent, and complete cleanup of that wreck. You will remove every single barrel from that hold and transport it to a secure facility. You will clean the sand, you will test the water, and you will not stop until this coastline is clean. That is non-negotiable." The lawyer was silent, calculating. That would cost millions, more than the payoff. "Second," Stephen continued, his voice gaining power. He was seeing it in his mind. "You're going to give this town something back. You are going to finance the construction and endowment of the Sea Haven Point Maritime Disaster Response Center. It will be a state-of-the-art facility, fully equipped for rough weather, open ocean rescue. You will fund it, permanently." The lawyer finally scoffed. "You are insane. You are asking for 10 times what this evidence is worth in damages. We will fight this. We will bury you in litigation." "You can't," Stephen said simply. "You can't litigate a lab report. You can't cross-examine a video. And you can't do it before 8 a.m. He looked at the clock, 4:25 a.m. "You have until 7:59 a.m. to call me back and agree. If you do, I will cancel the email. If you don't, or if I lose this call, or if I see Mario's truck anywhere near this cabin, the email goes. The choice is yours, containment or catastrophe." Stephen hung up. He did not sit. He made a fresh pot of coffee. He and Ghost walked out onto the porch as the first pale gray light of dawn broke over the fog-shrouded hills. He stared at his phone. 7:50 a.m., 7:55 a.m., 7:58 a.m. His heart was a hammer. At 7:58 and 30 seconds, the phone rang. He answered. "Yes." "We agree," the lawyer's voice said. It was dead, defeated. "We agree to all terms. A team will be mobilized from Seattle today." Stephen looked at his laptop. 7:59 a.m. He clicked the mouse, canceling the scheduled send. He closed the laptop. He looked down at Ghost, who was looking up at him, sensing the change in the air. The tension was gone. Stephen knelt and put his forehead against his dog's. "It's over," he whispered. "It's over, boy." The months that followed changed Sea Haven Point forever. The corporation, true to its word and terrified of exposure, moved with blinding speed. First came the barges, massive vessels that dwarfed the fishing fleet. The professional hazmat teams in their sealed white suits descended on the Odyssey. The cleanup was total. The sealed hatch was cut away, and hundreds of blue drums were lifted, one by crane, and taken away. The town watched, stunned. Mario and his truck disappeared. The Salty Gull Diner buzzed with rumors, but Stephen said nothing. Simultaneously, construction began on a plot of land overlooking the marina. A sleek, modern building of glass and cedar rose from the mud. The Odyssey itself was too large and too broken to be removed, but it was no longer a tomb. The corporation's engineers, at Stephen's direction, cleaned it, reinforced it, and cut safe access points into its hull. The symbol of the town's ghost story was being transformed. 1 year later. The day was clear, the Oregon sky a brilliant, painful blue. The wind was high, kicking up a heavy 4-foot chop in the surf. Stephen stood on the deck of a brand-new 40-foot rapid response boat. He was no longer the hermit. He was clean-shaven, his hair cut short. He wore a crisp navy blue uniform with a new patch on the shoulder. Sea Haven Point, MDRC, Director. In front of him were 6 young recruits, 3 men and 3 women in their 20s, all in dry suits, their faces bright with adrenaline and focus. "Listen up," Stephen shouted over the wind. "This is not a drill. This is the test. The water is cold. The current is fast. You make a mistake. You pay for it." He pointed toward the shore at the Odyssey. The wreck was still there, a massive rusted steel island, but it was now a training ground. "You see the target," Stephen said, pointing to a dummy they had tethered to the wreck in the surf zone. "The current is too strong for a direct approach. You will deploy the high line. This is the most complex technique we have. It is also the only one that works in a current this strong." Stephen felt a familiar, cold prickle. He was back in 2019. The storm. The trawler. This was the technique he had debated using, the one he had judged too slow, the one that might have saved her. "Watch me," he commanded. He grabbed the line gun, aimed, and fired. The line shot across the water, landing perfectly. He began to operate the winch, his movements sure, his voice strong, calling out commands. He was not a victim. He was a teacher. He watched as his 2 lead swimmers clipped in and began their transit. They were good. They were fast. He paused, the lesson underway, and looked toward the beach. There, on the bluff near the new center, was his old truck. And sitting patiently by the driver's side door was Ghost. The dog was older now, his silver-gray muzzle dusted with more white. He was watching the boat, watching his master, a silent, loyal witness to the entire journey. Stephen looked back at his team. They had reached the target. They were working the problem. The memory of Carrie's hand slipping from his grasp would never leave him. It was a scar on his soul, a part of his anatomy. For years, it had been a source of crushing, paralyzing grief. But now, watching these new, strong hands secure the rescue line, hearing his own voice call out the commands that would keep them safe, the memory felt different. It was no longer just a memory of loss. It was a memory of purpose. It was the why. He had not saved Carrie, but because of her, he would save countless others. He turned his face to the wind, the salt spray cold on his skin. It was not peace. Peace was too simple a word. It was atonement. The past can often feel like a shipwreck, a cold and terrifying place we are afraid to revisit. But true loyalty, like the bond between Stephen and Ghost, is a light that gives us the courage to dive into that darkness. It shows us that even our deepest wounds can be forged into our greatest purpose. We truly hope this story of atonement resonated with you. We read every comment, so please share your thoughts below. You can support our channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing this story. And the journey does not have to end. Our newest tale is waiting for you now on the screen.